They built an empire of lies, and now it's all falling apart. 20 years ago, China promised the world it would become the next great superpower. Massive GDP growth, gleaming megacities, technological dominance, the works. But here's what they didn't tell you. It was all fake. The growth numbers? Manipulated. The cities? Ghost towns. The economic miracle? Built on a mountain of debt that's about to bury them alive. Empire of lies. That's what China really built. And we're about to expose every single deception. Right now, as you watch this, China's youth unemployment is so bad they stopped publishing the real numbers. Their property market, worth more than the entire U.S. economy, is imploding. Major cities are going bankrupt, and the government is so desperate they're literally buying empty apartments just to hide the crisis. This isn't just China's problem. When an $18.7 trillion economy built on lies starts collapsing, everyone feels it. You think you know the story of China's rise? You don't know anything yet. What we're about to show you will completely change how you see the world's supposed next superpower. The empire of lies is crumbling, and the truth is more shocking than anyone imagined. Let's start with the biggest lie of all, China's economic growth. Beijing claims they hit exactly 5% GDP growth in 2024. Exactly 5%. What are the odds of hitting a round number like that in a real economy? Zero. The Rhodium Group estimates the real growth was around 2.4 to 2.8%. China had to lie about nearly half their economic performance just to look respectable. Here's the smoking gun. While reporting this strong growth, China was simultaneously cutting interest rates, launching emergency stimulus, and creating new ways to prop up their stock market. Even China doesn't believe their own numbers. And that 2.4% to 2.8% growth came at a staggering cost. China had to invest 40% of their entire economy to achieve it. The U.S. invests about 20%. China burns $40 to generate $100 of activity. That's not growth. That's economic arson. China's nominal GDP, the number that actually matters for real wages and government budgets, grew by only 4.2% in 2024. That's the slowest rate on record outside of the pandemic years. When your nominal growth is slower than your real growth, you've got serious problems. China's GDP deflator turned negative in 2024 and producer prices stayed in deflation, while headline inflation was barely plus 0.2%. The manufacturing sector tells an even uglier story. Remember when China was the world's factory floor? Those days are ending fast. In 2023 alone, foreign companies announced 378 major factory relocations out of China. Apple moved iPhone production to India. Samsung fled to Vietnam. Even Chinese companies like BYD are building factories in Mexico and Thailand. Why? Because Chinese workers aren't cheap anymore. Factory wages have tripled in the last decade. A worker in Vietnam costs half as much as one in China. In India, it's even less. But here's the kicker. China's workforce is shrinking. They've lost more than 41 million working-age people since 2020, and it's getting worse every year. But here's what reveals just how deep the deception goes. Those high-tech industries China keeps bragging about, they're tiny compared to their overall economy. Despite all the hype about becoming a tech superpower, high-tech manufacturing represents about 15% of industrial output. Meanwhile, traditional heavy industries are massively overbuilt and losing money. China's solution? Dump excess production on global markets at below-cost prices. That's not sustainable growth. That's economic warfare, and it's why countries are slapping tariffs on Chinese goods. The empire of lies convinced the world that China's rise was inevitable. But when your economy only grows through massive debt, when your workforce is aging out, and when factories are fleeing to cheaper countries, that's not a superpower in the making. That's a bubble about to burst. And speaking of bubbles, wait until you see what's happening to China's population. Because the demographic disaster unfolding right now makes their economic lies look like small change. Here's a number that should terrify Beijing. China lost 1.39 million people in 2024. That's the third straight year of population decline. But the real horror story is in the details. China's birth rate has collapsed to just 1.0 children per woman in 2024. To put that in perspective, you need 2.1 children per woman just to maintain a stable population. China isn't even close. They're not just below replacement level, they're in demographic freefall. And it's accelerating. Marriages have plunged dramatically over the last decade. When people aren't getting married, they're not having kids. When they're not having kids, your entire civilization starts to die. The numbers are staggering. By 2035, just 10 years from now, 1 in 3 Chinese people will be over 60. That's more than 400 million elderly people who need pensions, healthcare, and support. For comparison, that's more senior citizens than the entire population of the United States. But here's where the empire of lies really crumbles. Who's going to support all these elderly people? China's typical family structure looks like this: 4 grandparents, 2 parents, and 1 child. They call them 4-2-1 families. That 1 child is supposed to support 6 older people. It's mathematically impossible. The working age population has already peaked and is now shrinking by 3 million people every year. By 2050, China will have twice as many people outside the working age as inside it. And the young people who are supposed to be China's future, they're giving up. Youth unemployment is so bad that China literally stopped publishing the numbers. When they resumed with the new methodology in December 2023, they somehow claimed unemployment had magically dropped from over 21% to under 15%. Right. What they actually did was change the definition to exclude students, rural, unemployed, and people who'd given up looking for work. Independent estimates put real youth unemployment closer to 30%. That's 1 in 3 young Chinese people without work. Meet the lying flat generation. Young Chinese who've completely opted out of the rat race. They refuse to work overtime, refuse to buy homes, refuse to get married, refuse to have children. Some are literally retiring to rural areas to escape the economic pressure. It's a massive rejection of everything the Chinese system promised them, and it's spreading. The number of Chinese applying to emigrate hit record highs in 2024. The wealthy are sending their kids abroad and moving their money with them. China isn't just losing people, it's losing its best and brightest. Here's the brutal truth: demographics is destiny, and China's destiny is to grow old before it grows rich. But there's an even more sinister aspect to China's demographic lies: the gender imbalance. Thanks to the one-child policy and cultural preferences for male children, China now has 30 million more men than women. They call them bare branches, men with no hope of continuing their family line. And they're angry. China tried to fix the birth rate with cash incentives. Some provinces pay up to $1,400 per child. They've made fertility treatments free. None of it is working. Here's why. Nearly 36,000 kindergartens closed in just 2 years. Elementary schools are shutting down by the thousands. When young people can barely afford to support themselves, having children becomes impossible. The empire built on lies told its people that prosperity was guaranteed. But when your birth rate collapses, your workforce shrinks, and your young people give up on the future, that's not the foundation of a superpower. That's the foundation of a civilization in decline. But you haven't seen the worst part yet, because what's happening to China's property market isn't just an economic crisis, it's the complete destruction of middle-class wealth on a scale that has never been seen before. China's real estate market is worth $50 trillion, more than the entire U.S. economy, and it's all coming down. They built enough empty apartments to house multiple times China's population. Surveys estimate around 65 million vacant units. That's 21% of all homes in China. For perspective, the entire U.S. has 140 million housing units total. Chinese families have 70% of their wealth tied up in real estate. When property values collapse, they lose everything. And collapse they have. Prices drop 30% in some cities. Remember Evergrande? Defaulted on $300 billion. Country Garden? $187 billion. Together, Chinese developers owe more than France's entire GDP. Here's the evil part. Developers sold 20 million apartments before building them, using new buyer money to finish old projects. Now, construction has stopped forever on millions of pre-sold homes. Take Zhang Wei from Shenzhen. In 2020, he spent $400,000 on an apartment. Today, it's worth half that. His life savings gone. Local governments funded themselves by selling land to developers. With property frozen, cities are cutting salaries 50%. Some can't afford streetlights. Tianjin is literally selling government buildings. They can't afford their own offices. The smoking gun? Local governments have $9 trillion in hidden debt through special financing vehicles. That's bigger than Japan and Germany's economies combined. These vehicles are now defaulting. Instead of fixing the crisis, China's doubling down on deception. State companies are buying empty apartments to hide oversupply. They're arresting economists who publish negative data. When your solution to bad news is jailing messengers, you're not running an economy, you're running a cult. But there's an even darker layer to this crisis: the mortgage boycott movement we just mentioned. What started as isolated protests became a nationwide rebellion against the property system. Banks are now sitting on trillions in bad loans they can't acknowledge without triggering a financial meltdown. Some estimates suggest up to 40% of bank assets are tied to real estate in some form. When the property market dies, the banking system dies with it. Regional banks are already quietly failing. Small banks in Tier 3 cities have stopped making new loans entirely. The government response? Merge failing banks with healthier ones and hope nobody notices. Remember those ghost cities we mentioned? They're not just empty, they're actively deteriorating. Buildings constructed with substandard materials are literally crumbling before anyone ever lived in them. China built a $1 trillion mirage that's now turning to dust. And remember, this was supposed to be the foundation of China's middle class, the pathway to prosperity, the proof that the Chinese system worked. Instead, it's revealed as the biggest wealth destruction event in modern history. The empire of lies promised its people that real estate was a guaranteed path to riches. But when you build an entire economy on empty apartments and fabricated demand, the only guarantee is collapse. But if you think the property crisis is bad, wait until you see what's happening to China's social fabric. Because a generation of young Chinese isn't just losing money, they're losing hope. China had a deal with its people: give up political freedom, get economic prosperity. For 40 years it worked. Now that social contract is crumbling. The jobless generation we mentioned, they're not just unemployed, they're completely checking out. Marriage rates plunged 60% in the last decade. Consumer spending has stagnated. Young people aren't just worried about the future, they're giving up on it. The brain drain is accelerating. Immigration applications hit record highs in 2024. The wealthy are fleeing with their money. China is losing human capital it can't replace. Xi Jinping's response? Double down on control. More surveillance, more censorship, more nationalism. He's trying to replace the economic dream with the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But you can't eat nationalism. The regime is so desperate they're censoring economists who tell inconvenient truths. This isn't confident superpower behavior. This is a government that knows its foundational promises are exposed as lies. And that brings us to perhaps the biggest lie of all: China's supposed military strength and global influence. But before we expose China's military mirage, we need to talk about the man who accelerated China's decline, Xi Jinping. Remember how China used to work? Local officials had freedom to experiment, foreign investors were welcome, private business thrived. This system wasn't perfect, but it turned China into an economic powerhouse. Xi changed everything. Since taking power in 2012, he's rewired China's entire economy around one principle: his personal control. Take Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba. One speech criticizing financial regulators got his company's IPO canceled, triggered investigations, and made him disappear for months. Alibaba lost $400 billion in value because one businessman spoke out of turn. But Jack Ma wasn't the only casualty. Tech entrepreneur and actress Zhao Wei, once worth billions, saw her empire dismantled overnight after regulators decided she had too much influence. Real estate mogul Wang Jinlin was forced to sell off overseas assets and retreat from global expansion. The message was clear: no one gets bigger than Xi. Xi's anti-espionage law made basic market research potentially criminal. On a balance of payments basis, net foreign direct investment crashed 82% in 2023 to just $33 billion, the lowest since 1993. Businesses would rather abandon the world's biggest market than deal with this paranoia. Here's the devastating irony. Xi claimed these crackdowns would make China stronger by reducing chaos and disorder. Instead, they've killed the entrepreneurial spirit that made China's rise possible. Silicon Valley executives who once flocked to Beijing now avoid China entirely. Global companies are de-risking their supply chains to reduce dependence on Chinese manufacturing. Even Chinese entrepreneurs are moving their operations overseas. Local officials are now so terrified of making mistakes that they won't make decisions at all. When fear replaces expertise, you don't get growth, you get systemic destruction. Xi Jinping promised to make China great again. Instead, he's become the chief architect of China's decline, the man who killed the Chinese dream with his own hands. The leader who promised to make China great again has become the gravedigger of China's superpower dreams. China wants the world to believe it's a military superpower ready to challenge American dominance. But strip away the propaganda and you'll find another layer of the empire of lies. Yes, China has the world's largest military by personnel. Yes, they've been modernizing rapidly. But here's what they don't want you to know. Their military faces the same demographic crisis as the rest of the country. China's military is aging out. The one-child policy means fewer young men available for service. And those who are available, many are the same lying flat generation who have given up on everything else. But the real weakness isn't in personnel, it's in experience. China's last major military conflict was with Vietnam in 1979. Their military leaders have no experience managing large-scale modern warfare. Compare that to the United States, which has been conducting complex military operations continuously for decades. More revealing is what's happening to China's defense spending. Despite claims of military modernization, much of their defense budget goes to internal security, controlling their own population rather than projecting power globally. China's military buildup looks impressive on paper, but when your biggest security threat is your own citizens giving up on the system, that's not the foundation of global military power. Here's what we know for certain. China's Belt and Road Initiative, their supposed vehicle for global influence, is collapsing. Sri Lanka, under debt stress, leased its strategic Hambantota port to a Chinese state-owned firm for 99 years. Pakistan is struggling with Chinese debt payments. Instead of building influence, China has created a portfolio of bad debt around the world. The empire of lies thought it could buy global dominance through infrastructure loans. But when you're lending money you don't have to countries that can't pay it back, you're not building an empire, you're creating a house of cards. And now that house of cards is falling down. China's response? Double down on aggression. More threats against Taiwan, more confrontations in the South China Sea, more economic coercion against countries that displease it. This is how declining powers behave, not rising superpowers. But here's why this matters to everyone watching. When the world's second largest economy starts collapsing, the ripple effects are global. The global supply chains that seem so stable, they're being rewired around China's decline. The trade relationships that powered decades of growth, they're fracturing as countries realize they can't depend on an economy built on lies. And as China becomes more desperate, it becomes more dangerous. Economic collapse doesn't make authoritarian regimes moderate, it makes them radical. The economic foundation that was supposed to support China's rise to global superpower status simply isn't there anymore. You can't project power globally when your domestic economy is contracting, your population is aging, and your young people are opting out. The empire of lies is discovering that you can't lie your way to global dominance. Real power requires real economic strength, real demographic vitality, and real social cohesion. China has none of these things. But there's one final layer to China's empire of lies that almost nobody understands: the debt crisis that makes everything else look manageable. China's total debt exceeds 300% of GDP, higher than Japan at its bubble peak. Local governments owe $9 trillion in hidden debt alone. This creates a mathematical impossibility: debt growing faster than the economy. The only outcomes? Default or hyperinflation. Beijing knows this. That's why they're desperately manipulating statistics and forcing state companies to buy those empty apartments we talked about. The empire built on lies has painted itself into a corner. Here's the terrifying part. China's debt crisis isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's already causing real-world chaos in multiple provinces. Local government employees haven't been paid in months in some areas. Infrastructure projects are being abandoned mid-construction. Some cities can't afford basic services. The central government keeps promising bailouts, but they're running out of money too. Reports indicate China's foreign reserves face pressure as capital flees the country. They're selling U.S. Treasury bonds to fund domestic spending, clear sign of desperation. International lenders are starting to notice. Rating agencies have adjusted China's outlook, and foreign banks are restricting lending to Chinese entities. The world is slowly realizing that China's promises might not be as solid as they once appeared. When China's debt bomb explodes, it won't just destroy China, it will trigger the biggest economic reshuffling since World War II. Global supply chains will snap, trade relationships will fracture, and the world will finally see what happens when a $17 trillion economy built on deception comes crashing down. So where does that leave us? China's superpower dream was always built on quicksand. The impressive growth numbers were manipulated. The gleaming cities were largely empty. The demographic dividend has turned into a demographic disaster, and the property market that created middle-class wealth has destroyed it instead. This isn't just an economic crisis or a demographic problem. This is the systematic unraveling of an empire that was never as powerful as it appeared. The lies are catching up with reality, and reality is harsh. But here's what makes this collapse different from other economic disasters. China built its entire national identity around inevitable rise. They convinced not just the world, but themselves, that their dominance was destiny. When that narrative crumbles, it doesn't just hurt economically. It creates an existential crisis for the entire civilization. What is China if not the rising superpower? What is the Communist Party's legitimacy if not delivering prosperity? These are questions Beijing can't answer without admitting the empire of lies was exactly that, lies. China will likely remain a major economy, but the idea that they were destined to surpass America and dominate the 21st century, that was always a fantasy built on fabricated data, unsustainable debt, and demographic impossibilities. The most shocking part? We're watching this collapse happen in real time. While most of the world still believes in China's inevitable rise, the foundation has already cracked beyond repair. The empire of lies is crumbling from within, and no amount of propaganda can hold back economic gravity forever. What do you think? Are we witnessing the end of China's superpower ambitions, or is this just a temporary setback? And what does this mean for the global balance of power in the coming decades? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Fall of Nations for more deep dives into the forces reshaping our world. Hit that notification bell because the story of China's empire of lies is far from over.